So I've had an idea that could be very cool, or it could be really dumb, and we're about to find out together. When you do a PhD, you have to do what's called a literature review, where you situate your project within academic writing and research that's come before. So I've been reading a lot about affect theory, which is kind of the major hook that I'm hanging this project on. And I've been typing on like a first draft chapter of what that's going to be. And even though I know that's going to be changed a million times beforehand in a long time from now, I decided I'm going to share what I have so far with you guys so that you can be part of the thinking and the process and not just be handed a final yes, that's a word. Anyway, this is going to be long, so I'm going to try to be fast. I wasn't able to memorize all of it and speak it to camera, so I'm kind of stuck with reading it out loud, and even then I stumble on every second word in the dictionary. So I have to make it visually interesting somehow, and I couldn't figure it out until I remembered that one of you guys sent an email and asked me, how did I get to here? What is my background? So I'm going to do a visual showreel that you can watch whilst you're listening to the theory. And I'll add a little bit of text in the bottom to tell you like what the films are and the career I've had, I guess. I just make stuff. Is that a career? Could be. Yeah, so you could choose whether or not you want to watch the showreel and read textbooks or listen to the academic writing.
That is one big pile of shit.
As a working filmmaker, my primary interest lies in the creation of emotionally engaging audiovisual narratives that employ the full scope of the language of film in the manipulation of the narrative material in order to elicit the desired emotional response in the audience. To me, as both a maker and an audience member, the expression and experience of mood and emotion is more important than plot. That is not to say that plot is not important, nor to claim that plot has no effect on emotion, only that to me the true quality of a narrative lays in how effective or affective something is being told, more than what is being told. When filmmakers write about their practice, a common unifying theme is the emphasis on how they are crafting their cinematic narratives with the emotional experience of the audience in mind. Just a few examples of this would be director Sidney LUMET, writer and director David MAMET, and editor and sound composer Walter Murch, who writes, respectively,
"But what is it about emotionally? What is the effect of this on the audience? How do you want the audience to feel? If they are feeling what you want them to feel all the way through the film, you've done about as much as you can ever do."
This link between an audience's level of emotional investment and enjoyment of a narrative is not at all exclusive to film and has been written about long before affect theory existed. In 1757, for example, David Hume wrote in Of Tradegy,
"It seems an unaccountable pleasure which the spectator of a well-written tragedy receives from sorrow, terror, anxiety, and other passions that are in themselves disagreeable and uneasy. The more they are touched and affected, the more they are delighted with the spectacle. The audience are pleased in proportion as they are afflicted, and never are so happy as when they employ tears, sobs, and cries to give vent to their sorrow, and relieve their heart, swollen with the tenderest sympathy and compassion."
Writing at almost the same time, in The Theory of Mortal Sentiments, Adam Smith notes how this pleasure is linked to empathy and imagination.
"By the imagination we place ourselves in his situation, we conceive ourselves enduring all the same torment, we enter as it were into his body, and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them."
In no other medium before it is this link between empathy, imagination, and emotion as strong as through the effective qualities of the audiovisual language of film, which has the combined and cumulative power to transport you into the emotional experience of the characters themselves.
More than any other medium of human communication, the moving picture makes itself sensuously and sensibly manifest as the expression of experience by experience.
And almost as soon as the medium of film itself was born, filmmakers started exploring its effective qualities. We can trace this exploration from the Russian formalist movement all the way to contemporary film theory. Returning to film editor and sound designer Walter Murch for a second, his quote continues directly on from the above to say,
"What they, the viewers, finally remember is not the editing, not the camera work, not the performances, not even the story, it's how they felt."
Ironically, while the audiences may not remember, and many filmmakers, like for instance British cinematographer Roger Deakins, who on his podcast Team Deakins, which is highly recommended by the way, shares both his own views on filmmaking and interviews fellow filmmakers, where the importance of the emotional experience of the audience comes up over and over, and would argue that while we should not notice the camera work in editing, the emotional engagement of an audience is in fact inextricably linked to how the audiovisual language of film enables the audience to experience and understand the feelings of the characters. As film editor Mick Audsley writes,
"When successful, the collision of sound and pictures engages the audience with an economy and sophistication that words can rarely achieve. This narrative power is the very heartbeat of cinema."
Professor of Communication, Media and Culture and writer of affect theory Greg Singh agrees, saying that
"We must bear in mind the importance here of both the story being told and how they are told cinematically, itself a story-making and telling process placed within the context of psychological material that is brought to the act of viewing."
As promised by the title of this chapter, this approach to film theory relates directly back to the thinking of filmmakers, for instance in how
cinematographers believe that the way something's lit, there's a direct connection to what an audience feels.
This project is built upon my fascination with and ongoing quest as a filmmaker to understand and master this narrative power. Affect theory, then, being the study of how cinema affects us on a sensory and emotional level, is therefore the perfect framework for this project. Like Greg Singh writes,
"For a cultural form such as cinema, which is so crucially tied in with telling human stories and concerned with attempts at expressing human emotion, particularly in popular forms, it seems vitally important to address the question of affect and emotion."
While a detailed history and evolution of affect theory lays beyond the scope of this project, a brief discussion of its broader strokes and their impact on this project is needed, especially for any readers unfamiliar with the concept of affect theory, as I once was. Additionally, a clear definition of what is meant by the words affect, emotion and feeling within the context of this project is very much in order. In her article, Feeling in Filmmaking, the Design and Affect of Film Sound, Lucy Donaldson gives a very clear and useful definition of affect theory.
Discussion of cinematic effect most typically attends to response, the impact of the film as we experience it.
More specifically, affect theory is concerned with what feelings are and their importance in how they relate to the world, and looks at film as an embodied experience, meaning it discusses the cinematic encounter as a relationship between the viewer and the viewed, most often focusing on the emotional encounter as opposed to a textual study of the plot and structure. In many ways, affect theory is a reaction to, or like Sean CUBITT puts it, a course correction away from, the emphasis on text of the psychoanalytical film theory of the mid-70s to 90s.
In English language cultures, for many years, the privilege given to the text in literary studies demonstrated some of the worst aspects of Western tradition. It encourages a belief in the poverty and insignificance of the reader as opposed to the infinite richness and profundities of the text. In the same motion, the reader is reduced to a merely subjective relation to the text, a secondary role subordinate to the text, or, as the semioticians have it, subjected to it.
Not since the heyday of the Russian formalists has film theory put such an emphasis on the encounter between cinema and audience, better reflecting the way filmmakers themselves approach the creation of the narrative material encountered.
Although engagements with cinematic effect can be roughly grouped into two principal frameworks, drawing from either existential phenomenology as developed by MERLEAU-PONTY or the work of Gilles Deleuze, for both camps this translates into thoughts of film meaning being forged through the shared encounter of film and audience.
A few years back, I sent a short film to a friend for feedback. She replied, "It's fine." 1 week later, she cried while watching the exact same short film in a movie theater. It turns out she had watched it the first time on her phone while on the toilet. Viewing experience affects affect. And affect theory helps us explore and understand this relationship between the viewer and the viewed, and her differences in embodied experience in her cinematic encounter. Confusingly, within affect theory, the words affect, feeling, and emotion are used somewhat interchangeably, and writers on affect theory spend a lot of ink on explaining their definition of, in particular, affect, often in relation to each other. However, as this project needs clear definitions to work from, I will be using the following definitions as supported by Eric Schausi in Media/Culture Journal. The word affect is used to describe a reflexive bodily reaction that precedes emotion, an experience of intensity that occurs spontaneously and unconsciously, like fright. A feeling is your own personal reaction to stimuli, an evaluation that is checked against your distinctive values and experiences, while an emotion is the outwardly viewable response to the stimuli, like crying, facial reactions, or laughter. To put this into context, not long ago, I was watching a film with a particularly brutal rape scene where some of my students had made. At first, I was startled and shocked, which is affect. Then I felt disgusted at what the characters were doing, which is a feeling, my evaluation of it. And then I experienced sadness that materialized bodily as tears, i.e. emotion. As the following quotes show, the above definition seems to conform to a somewhat general consensus.
One has command over feeling, whereas affect intrudes against one's will and can only be repressed with difficulty. Emotions are elemental outbursts and effects are not made or willfully produced, they simply happen. Subjects are overwhelmed and traversed by affect, but they have or possess their own emotions. Feeling is an operation of evaluation about the thing, reflection, how we feel about it.
These definitions will become important as I later in the project start to discuss whether or not immersion intensifies purely sensory, meaning affective response, or if it also intensifies emotional response, meaning feeling and emotion. Stephen Shaviro, in his book The Cinematic Body, takes a clear stance against postmodern psychoanalytical film theory, going so far as to saying it has all the attributes of a religious cult based on sacred texts. In an attempt to break new ground in film theory, he grounds his book in the post-structural theory of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and in an auto-ethnographic approach discusses his own pre-reflexive responses to film, writing what he himself refers to as an extremely personal book that
foregrounds visceral, affective responses to film, in sharp contrast to most critics' exclusive concern with issues of form, meaning, and ideology. In film viewing, there is pleasure and more than pleasure, a rising scale of seduction, delirium, fascination, and utter absorption in the image. The pleasures cannot be separated from the bodily agitations, the movements of fascination, the reactions of attraction and repulsion, of which they are the extension and the elaboration. Such a scientific attempt to distance oneself is especially problematic in the case of film theory, whose object is not just particular films, but the very process of film viewing itself. I am too deeply implicated in the pleasures of film viewing, and too embarrassed by my complicity with or subordination to them, to be able to give a full and balanced account.
In short, he finds psychoanalytical text to be based mostly around suspicion, disavowal, and rejection, and too far removed from discussing the actual reason audiences watch movies, and how the cinematic apparatus puts the audience
in direct contact with intensive, unrepresentable fluxes of corporal sensation. What inspires the cinematic spectator is a passion for that very loss of control, that abjection, fragmentation, and subversion of self-identity that psychoanalytic theory so dubiously classifies under the rubrics of lack and castration.
He makes the case for thinking otherwise about film, that film theory should be less about an analytical theory, but more a theory on affect.
My path leads from the paradoxical nature of cinematic perception, through the mechanisms by which cinema generates effect, and on to the position of the cinematic spectator.
As will become evident later in this project, Shaviro's approach to discussing film greatly informs this project, both in how I ask my test audiences to report on their embodied experience of the different film forms and viewing experiences, but also in his autoethnographic infusing of himself into discussion of the cinema affects, as I self-evaluate both the process and the results as the filmmaker behind the tested short films, and how creative decisions are founded in the importance of the director to act as the first audience of the created. Another writer on affect theory that takes a Deleuzian approach in her attempt to craft a new way ahead for film theory is Barbara M. Kennedy. In her book, Deleuze and Cinema, The Aesthetic of Sensation, she uses a Deleuzian approach to film theory to form a new form of post-structural feminist film theory that accounts for visual pleasure within films that are problematic from a psychoanalytic feminist point of view. Moving away from theory that focuses on textual study of representation, signification, structuralism, pleasure and desire, and into viewing film as a body which performs, through affect and sensation, she argues for
a new aesthetic theory, which accounts for how the affective is formulated through color, sound, movement, force, intensity, not just through physical mechanisms, but through material such as the mind/brain and body.
And while this project is grateful for the discovery of the ways affect theory can approach film in a non-binary, ungendered way, and thus not exclude any of its audiences on a theoretical level, and the book's focus on color, sound, movement, force and intensity, terms a filmmaker can recognize, the book ultimately winds up becoming a self-referential theoretical work in danger of treating Deleuze and his text in the same cult-like manner Shaviro revolted against. In many ways, this project sits closer to the other major strand of affect theory, namely that of film phenomenology, inspired in particular by Maurice MERLEAU-PONTY. Existential phenomenology, i.e. the philosophy of experience, of describing the structure of experience in
an attempt to describe the basic structures of human experience and understanding from a first-person point of view, in contrast to the reflexive, third-person perspective that tends to dominate scientific knowledge and common sense.
Phenomenology sees perception as a bodily experience, as we
do not and cannot understand it in abstraction from its concrete corporal conditions. Phenomenology is based on the intuitive exploration and faithful description of the phenomena within the context of the world of our lived experience, Lebenswelt, anxious to avoid reductionist oversimplifications and overcomplications by preconceived theoretical patterns.
In his book Feeling Film, Greg Singh, who we will return to the writing of in several of the chapters ahead, who in his own words is greatly influenced by the existential phenomenology of Maurice MERLEAU-PONTY, describes the structure of his own personal filmic experiences and how the film creates affect in the moment and the lingering emotions in relation to the filming experience within the film itself, and how both of these are affected by changes in the narrative material between different, meaning altered versions of the film itself, i.e. When he's comparing, for instance, theatrical and director's cut of the same film. Singh's approach to and use of film phenomenology makes a lot of sense to me both as a viewer and a maker, and has subsequently greatly influenced this project. This will become evident as we return to his writing several times in the following chapters, but also less obviously in how I am creating and structuring the film cycles themselves, meaning I'm creating different versions of the same narrative to evaluate how the changes in film form will alter affect, in the same way that he's discussing theatrical and director's cuts, and their evaluation, what questions I ask of the test subjects, and last but not least, the decision to auto-ethnographically bring in my own descriptions of my personal evaluation of the film cycles into the evaluation process. Vivian Sobchak is another film scholar who takes a clear stance against psychoanalytical film theory, saying that
Neo-Freudian psychoanalysis has not exhausted my experience, although it has often exhausted my patience,
and that it does not reflect or explain her own experience of film viewership. In a summary that very much reflects my own misgivings of psychoanalytical film theory, she states that,
in most contemporary theory, viewing in the cinema leads to no good or, at best, to the remedial practice of demystifying the cinema's material, structural, and ideological pathology and, at worst, to a pleasure that is guilty and must be adjudged perverse.
Instead, her book revels in the joy and freedom offered to her by phenomenology as both a philosophy and a research procedure to tackle film theory anew. Through the phenomenological theme of intentionality, i.e.,
the unique peculiarity of experiences to be the consciousness of something.
She rewrites film theory through the lens of phenomenology, using mainly, but not exclusively, the theory of Maurice MERLEAU-PONTY. Reading the film experience from inside and out, she lays out both what film phenomenology is and her take on what film theory should become, and why.
What else is a film if not an expression of experience by experience? And what else is the primary task of film theory if not to restore to us, through reflection upon that experience and its expression, the original power of the motion picture to signify? If we are to understand how we understand the film experience, why it has significance for us, and why we care about it, we must remember that experience is located in the lived body. Indeed, the cinema uses modes of embodied existence, seeing, hearing, physical and reflective movement, as the vehicle, the stuff, the substance of its language. It also uses the structures of direct experience, the centering and bodily situating of existence in relation to the world of objects and others, as the basis for the structures of its language. Thus, as a symbolic form of human communication, the cinema is like no other. Thus, the film experience is a system of communication based on bodily perception as a vehicle of conscious expression. It entails the visible, audible, kinetic aspects of sensible experience to make sense visibly, audibly, and haptically.
Her phenomenological approach to film theory, how it should explore the original power of the motion picture to signify, through reflecting on the cinema experience, links directly to how this project uses film phenomenology as a research procedure, in terms of the way I structure the audience questionnaire and the focus group interviews, in the evaluation of its film cycles in order to evaluate the expression of experience in different viewing experiences, albeit in a simplified manner than the rules and structure she recounts and lays out.
As both systemic philosophy and systematic procedure, phenomenological inquiry is less a set of steps to be applied programmatically to phenomena than it is a series of critical commitments made by the researcher to respond openly to the phenomena of consciousness and to her own consciousness of phenomena.
Alas, the book itself, like that of Barbara Kennedy, also falls into the trap of self-referential theoretical work, less actionable as a new approach to investigation of the film experience than one would hope, and too short in new readings of filmic experiences. As discussed above, affect theory makes a distinction between affect, feeling, and emotion. In Feeling Film, Greg Singh makes a case for, instead of approaching thinking and feeling as opposites, to instead explore how they coexist and interweave, an approach that has informed this project. In a similar way to his argument, I would argue that the cinematic encounter consists of both the immediate sense state phenomenon of experiencing affect, feeling, and emotion produced in the moment of watching, as well as the post-experience evaluation, meaning how we feel about it afterwards, the individual evaluation of it over time. Shaviro agrees, noting that
privatized emotion can never entirely separate itself from the effect from which it is derived.
And I would argue that these two states account for the allure of the cinematic experience, not plot. That affect theory is spot on when they say that understanding affect, not textual studies, is the key to why audiences are continuously drawn to the audiovisual experience of film. The first films that were shown were not narrative stories at all, yet people sought them out in droves. They showed up for the sense state phenomenon of having a train rush directly at them. not for a story, and yet their post-experience evaluation was so strong that word spread, making film so popular it eventually evolved into the emotional encounter we have today.
It is important to recognize that narrative is neither primary nor necessary to cinema, and it forms no part of any putative essence of the medium. Narrative, then, is not an essential quality of film, but only a potential and secondary quality arising from the production of time in the differentiation within and between frames.
I would argue that both these states, the sense state phenomenon and post-experience evaluation, not only accounts for why audiences continue to enjoy the cinematic encounter. That is, that they not only explain our cultural obsession with the movie-going experiences, but that they also account for why we have favorite movies that we return to over and over again. That it is to experience both the immediate affect and the lingering feeling over again. The cinema culture and rewatch culture cannot be explained by one without the other, but through the affective and emotional states the storytelling experience puts us in. Something Greg Singh writes about at length, calling it a lived, warm encounter. Nor can rewatch culture be explained by plot. Fundamentally, we return to narratives for the affective and emotional aspects of its experience, not the plot. Plot information is only ever just information, and is not an experience in and of itself. Humans running from dinosaurs from point A to point B is plot, but experiencing that journey through Grant, Lex and Tim as facilitated by the acting and audiovisual language of film is narrative. To experience and be part of the story world, or the story experience if you will. After all, we say that we enjoy a film, joy being an emotional response, not a cognitive appreciation of the narrative itself, but the way it is told and the way the telling affects us as viewers. For this reason, it is important for me to test both the sense state, i.e. the engagement, as well as the post-experience evaluation, i.e. the enjoyment, in the short films I'm making. And as you will see as we move along, this will be reflected in this test subject self-evaluation questionnaire. Yeah, that's what I had this time. I guess. Did that work out? I don't know, I haven't made it yet.